Evening, everyone. Today, I have been given the privilege of introducing our keynote speaker for this event, Mr. Vincent Sweeney. Vincent Sweeney holds both a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in civil engineering from the Technical University of the Nova Scotia. He was admitted to the Association of Professional Engineers of Nova Scotia, APENS, as a full member in 1989. He is currently head of the Caribbean Sub-Regional Office for UN Environment Program and was previously based in Nairobi, Kenya for 4 years as the coordinator of the Global Program of Action for the Protection of the Marine Environment from Land-Based Activities, or GPA, located within the United Nations Environment Program's headquarters. The GPA addresses the priority pollutants of wastewater, marine litter, and nutrients, and is the host of the Global Wastewater Initiative, the Global Partnership on Nutrients Management, and the Global Partnership on Marine Litter. He served for 10 years as Executive Director of the Caribbean Environmental Health Institute and has worked with water utilities for the Caribbean and in private consulting firms. With that being said, ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Mr. Vincent Sweeney.
Thank you, everyone, for the opportunity for presenting and also for being on time. It's nice to see this many people at the start of a session this hour of the evening. My presentation is going to try and provoke a little bit of thought and perhaps be more general for some than maybe you expect, but also try to get into some specifics, not only of Jamaica, but of the Caribbean. First of all, I'd like to share very briefly a couple of slides on the organization which I represent, UNEP. We are a global agency, but we have offices around the world. And of course, we advocate and we promote environmental management as part of the Sustainable Development Agenda. And why were we set up? Well, we've been reminded of that very recently. And in fact, as we approach our 50th anniversary, it's important to recognize why we exist. And our Secretary General reminded us last year that making peace with nature is one of the defining tasks of the 21st century, and it should be our priority. I wanted to speak a bit about Jamaica, first of all, and then broaden it to the Caribbean. Jamaica, as most of us would know, will be a small island developing state. And what we may not realize is the uniqueness of the natural resources as well as biodiversity in Jamaica. And this all will come together a little bit later on in my presentation. But as a result, this uniqueness, Jamaica, like many other islands, is very much vulnerable to environmental threats. And we, in fact, rely on these natural resources for everything from our survival as well as economic development. This slide highlights some of the what we call challenges in Jamaica, and I'm going to go through each of them in a little bit more detail before I get into specifically the discussion on climate change. We are faced with a number of natural resource management challenges, both in Jamaica and in the wider Caribbean, including overfishing, poor agricultural practices, and practices such as deforestation and land degradation, which all pose threats to our biodiversity. And like I said, I'll come back to explain why this is important a little bit later on. We also have concerns with water management and our waste management, including sanitation, issues such as pollution from sewage, pollution from oil potentially, the bauxite industry and the mining waste that accompanies that, which you're going to speak about or you hear about later on, as well as access to resources such as water resources, and other forms of pollution such as air pollution, pollution from plastics, and as we are very familiar, marine litter as well. Some of the issues that we have to deal with in the Caribbean include eutrophication, and this is something which can be associated with the death of coral reefs, large amounts of algae growing on our coastlines, and more recently it's being associated with the sargassum episodes across the region as well. Other issues which we have to be concerned with include water management, and this includes both the location of the water resources and its distribution. In other words, getting it from where where it's plentiful to where it's actually needed. And Jamaica is an interesting case in that most of the rainfall is in the north and northeast, when most of the population is in the southern part of the island. So we need to get those resources to that part of the country. We also have, of course, the issues of pollution, and most of us are very familiar with the waste that we see in our gullies, and it's even more evident after rainfalls. What we may not recognize so much is that wastewater more generally, which is collected in our sewage system and is taken to treatment facilities, may not necessarily be treated to the standard that we would want for eventually discharge into the marine environment. We also have concerns with pollution of our groundwater, and nitrates is an example, which can make our groundwater unpalatable or unsafe for human consumption. Of course, we are very familiar with pollution of land, and this includes everything from solid waste, bulky waste, even tires. And this, unfortunately, in many of our islands, ends up on the coastal zone. Jamaica is not the only country that is to be concerned with this, but certainly it is a real issue in Jamaica as well. And this pollution can impact on marine life, unfortunately, as well as, of course, other industries. And some of the impacts can be on larger mammals, as well as other sea life. Clean energy is also a concern. And the delays with exploiting renewable energy, such as solar, wind, hydro, has been identified as a concern in Jamaica. Energy conservation opportunities where they exist may not have been capitalized upon, and other issues such as energy efficiency, including fuel efficiency and solar heating and cooling alternatives, are all concerns in Jamaica as well as the rest of the Caribbean. Then we reach to what perhaps gets closer to the topic of our discussion, disasters, particularly hurricanes or weather-related disasters. And you may not know this, but between 2001 and 2012, Jamaica experienced 11 storm events and several flood and drought events. And the combined loss and damage was approximately 128 billion Jamaica dollars. At the time, there was probably over $1 billion US. In fact, Hurricane Sandy resulted in direct and indirect damage of Jamaica, almost $10 billion, or 0.8% of the GDP as of 2011. Across the Caribbean, we are seeing decreased amounts of precipitation and shifts in functioning of terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. Sea level rise is projected to increase. We're also expecting an increase in geographic range and incidence of things like insect-borne diseases as a result of the changes in climate. We're also expecting to see increased risk of hunger and famine and displacement due to, as I mentioned already, rising sea level. So without assuming that people know what climate change is or even believe that there is climate change, I wanted to spend a couple of minutes and provoke some discussion. Climate change is the change of climate attributed directly or indirectly to human activity that alters the composition of the planet's atmosphere and which adds to the natural variability. There are people who say that, well, climate is always variable, but this adds to the natural variability, of the climate observed over comparable periods of time. And what are the causes? Well, climate change is a product of the current economic development model. And what does that mean? Our economies are linked to the use of hydrocarbons and conversion of natural systems to other land uses. When burning hydrocarbons, carbon dioxide or CO2 is produced, which is the main greenhouse gas. Deforestation and degradation produce CO2, and we may not have even recognized that. And these reduce the natural ability to absorb greenhouse gas. The change in the composition of the atmosphere by a higher concentration of CO2 and other greenhouse gases increases the temperature and causes changes in the water cycle. And this slide will give you an idea of what happens on a day-to-day basis when we experience solar radiation from the sun. Some of it is absorbed, some of the infrared radiation passes through the atmosphere. Some of that too is absorbed, some is emitted. But if there is a shift in the dynamic, then the Earth can get warmer than it should be. So what are some of the impacts of climate change? Well, of course, temperature increase. We're all familiar with that. We know it affects rainfall patterns, increased intensity of events, extreme weather events, rising sea level, I've mentioned already, changes in ecosystems, and even something which may not seem relevant to us, but melting of glaciers is of concern. But is the climate really changing? There are some people who would argue that it's not. And that's why I'm spending a little bit of time just speaking very quickly to the debate. On the 15th of January in 2020, the WMO, which is the World Meteorological Organization, confirmed that 2019 was the second hottest year on record after 2016. Then 2020 came along. And average temperatures for the 5 years from 2015 to 2019 and the 10-year period from 2010 to 2019 were actually the hottest on record. Since the 1980s, every decade has been warmer than the previous one. This trend is expected to continue because of record levels of the same greenhouse gases that I was talking about in the atmosphere that has caused our climate to change. And you may have heard of the discussions about how COVID has maybe affected things, but despite the brief dip in CO2 emissions caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, the world is still heading for a temperature rise in excess of 3 degrees this century. And it may not seem like a lot, but that's far beyond the Paris Agreement goals of limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees. And in fact, preferably keeping it down to 1.5. And this gives you an idea of the consistent increase in temperature. The black line going from left to right, you can see is increasing temperature, and you can also see on this slide the concentrations of CO2 increasing. I won't spend too much time on this slide, but this more or less highlights some of the effects of the changes in temperature over time, and it affects everything from food, yields, water supply, our ecosystems, extreme weather events, and the intensity and frequency, and of course, other irreversible changes in our climate system. Now, general circulation models have all projected an increase in the frequency of high severity Category 4 and Category 5 storms making landfall over the next century. You may remember in 2017, there were a number of devastating events, and some of these projections are supported by the events of 2017, where Dominica, Antigua, and Barbuda, St. Kitts and Nevis, and Puerto Rico were among the countries badly hit by hurricanes. Jamaica may not have been hit severely by hurricanes, but certainly these are some of the impacts of severe weather and flooding in recent times here in Jamaica. So what can we expect? Well, small island developing states in the Caribbean contribute less than 1% of the total global greenhouse gas emissions, and yet are expected to be among the earliest and most severely impacted by climate change. Climate change and climate variability will also have a profound impact on natural resource management, particularly regarding resources such as fresh water, and that's why I was highlighting the various concerns in Jamaica, even in the absence of climate change, such as fresh water, which will be affected by changes in precipitation, as well as saltwater intrusion. In other words, saltwater getting into our groundwater, impacting both the quality and the quantity. And these projections have serious implications for countries such as Barbados, for example, which is one of the highest ranking water scarce nations globally. Taking these compounding effects into consideration, the need to develop appropriate adaptation strategies is paramount. Climate change is also expected to have significant impacts on food production, which I've mentioned already, in the fisheries and agriculture sectors across the Caribbean. Increased thermal stress is resulting in decreased yield and increased operating costs for crop production. In addition, increased climate stress along with overharvesting and destruction of nurseries like mangroves is resulting in significant reduction in fish catch. These types of climate-related impacts are currently affecting industries, communities, and individuals, not only in Jamaica, but across the Caribbean. And although many coping strategies are currently being employed by farmers and fishers to manage the stresses brought on by increased climate variability, these practices are not sufficient to counteract increasing climate risks. Significant resources are required to rebuild following the impact of powerful high-intensity storms. We therefore need to focus efforts on building resilience to capably and swiftly recover from the devastation caused. Community outreach, education, and involvement are key to building resilience. Educating and empowering communities in low-lying floodplains and along the coastline on what to do, where to go, how to prepare, and how to rebuild is an integral part that is often overlooked. We should also take note that what occurred to a few of our Caribbean islands in 2017, where in some instances they had back-to-back hurricanes, so they didn't even have enough opportunity to recover from one when they were hit by another, and they didn't have time to pick up the pieces. So as a region, you can understand that we are vulnerable. And our vulnerability generally, as I mentioned very early in the presentation, that vulnerability is exacerbated by the impacts of climate change. And some of those vulnerabilities include our location. We know that we are in the middle of the hurricane belt, and these lines in the photograph on the right give you an idea of the path of many of the hurricanes over the past few years. We also have a socioeconomic circumstances. We cannot rebound as easily as other countries can rebound. There's income inequality. We also have the issue of population distribution, and we may not think as much about that in Jamaica, but in some of the islands, in the photograph on the left, you can see in Dominica, the dark green is where most of the population lies. And in the pictures on the right, you can see the orange areas in the middle photo indicates the population density in Belize. And you can see that the majority of the population is found along the coast. We don't have capacity, as I've mentioned already, and being able to clean up after a disaster is one of the major concerns that we face right after the disaster, but then the rebuilding process is an even greater challenge. We're unable to adapt. Can you imagine if 100% of the houses in Jamaica, for example, lost their roofs in one storm event? What impact would that have on our livelihoods, on our economies, and our way of living? We're also heavily dependent on tourism. So the impacts of hurricanes can exacerbate the challenges that we already face with the tourism industry, things like coastal erosion and other infrastructure. I've mentioned already the threat to low-lying areas, and in this slide you can see that most of the population again of Guyana is located along the coastline, and the darker red areas are the areas where there's the highest population. So you can understand that the majority of the population is in a vulnerable location. We also have water scarcity. I've mentioned already the issues related to increased vector-borne diseases. But in all of this, we have opportunities. I don't want us to believe that everything is lost. The United Nations has proposed a blueprint to align policies on COVID-19 and climate action. In fact, just this morning, the UN Deputy Secretary General made this following statement. She said, we need a transformative recovery encompassing key sectors such as renewable energy, sustainable mobility, and tourism. A green pandemic recovery could cut up to 25% of the emissions we would expect to see in 2030 based on policies which were in place before COVID-19. Governments should pull out all the stops to implement what we call a green recovery and strengthen their pledges before the next climate meeting in 2021. Measures to prioritize include direct support for zero emission technologies and infrastructure, reducing fossil fuel subsidies, and promoting nature-based solutions. Now, while biodiversity and ecosystems are threatened by climate change, their conservation, restoration, and sustainable management generate significant and practical nature-based solutions to climate change, including, for example, large-scale landscape restoration and reforestation. Terrestrial ecosystems store almost 3 times the amount of carbon found in the atmosphere, while healthy oceans absorb over 25% of annual carbon dioxide emissions. Transformative climate actions are needed to cut emissions, promote clean energy, build climate resilience, and catalyze climate action investments. Around 2/3 of global emissions are linked to private households. So some of us may not think that we're doing that much, but in our private households, we are in fact contributing to global emissions. The mobility sector, residential, and food sectors each contribute about 20% of lifestyle emissions. Governments must enable and encourage consumers to avoid high carbon consumption. Possible actions in the Caribbean and in Jamaica include improving energy efficiency, example, in our housing, more options for renewable energy, and policies to reduce food waste. And these are just a couple examples of opportunities. This slide, I'm not going to spend any time on it because I know I've gone a few minutes over, but you can see where Jamaica sits in relation to other countries in the Caribbean in terms of market penetration for electric vehicles. We have hardly any in Jamaica, but other parts of the Caribbean are moving ahead. And studies have also demonstrated that electric vehicles are cheaper to operate than internal combustion engines. So the arguments that they cost more or we're not ready for them yet can be combated by these figures. Finally, I wanted to talk about plastics. We tend not to maybe think of a link between plastics and climate, but the consumption of plastic bottles, which is very high in many of our hotels in the region, can significantly affect greenhouse gas emissions. And in this slide, you can see the emissions linked to single-use plastic bottles in all of the hotels in Punta Cana and Dominican Republic would be equivalent to the energy required for an entire small city. So what's next? Well, there's a momentum to transform how small island states sustainably develop and adapt. Organizations such as the UN, CARICOM institutions, and of course UWI are engaged in promoting, supporting, and or implementing projects which increases the region's adaptability and resilience to climate change impacts. But beyond this, we must make climate change personal. In order to make resilience personal and make achieving sustainability personal to you and I, it is our responsibility, both mine and yours, to change the system as we know it. It is our responsibility, therefore, to create a personal consciousness that resonates towards achieving national and regional change, because whether we want to hear it or not, this is our reality. A single question can keep our eyes fixed on the goal. What kind of a world do we want to leave for those who come after us? Thank you very much.